Visiting the Grave of Her Fiancé by S.C. Turnbo. Across the hollow west of Holdenpile Graveyard, the way the old road leads, is a low hill that was once covered with trees and undergrowth. The land is now in cultivation, and just south of this rise toward the river is the site of the old Pete Holdenpile residence. Just west of this across the hollow is where the Matt Holdenpile houses stood. The graveyard is situated on a beautiful plot of ground a quarter-mile from the river and is known as the John Riddle Cemetery. Now, between the graveyard and the bank of the river is a spring where the old cabin stood in which Elijah Barnes and his family lived when the Civil War began. This is on the north side of the White River in Kesey Township in Marion County. During the third year of the war, a young man of the name of John King was living at Aunt Sally Holdenpile's, who with her married daughter, Mrs. Sarah Jane Murphy, was living in the Pete Holdenpile house. John Jones' family was occupying the Matt Holdenpile dwelling. Mr. King had come across the river from East Sugarloaf Creek, and where he was engaged to be married to Miss Pop Wilmoth, a sister of George Wilmoth, not Preacher George. Now, a young horse had run away with him, and he got his face badly bruised and was swelled. The morning while he was there, a company of mounted men rode up to the yard fence and halted and questioned the young man very closely and threatened to kill him. But Mrs. Holdenpile and her daughter pleaded with the men not to kill him, and the company rode down the road by the graveyard and crossed the river at the ford where the head of the Ireland lies up against the upper end of the old Allen Trimble land. But before the company reached the ford of the river, two of the cavalrymen dropped out of ranks and rode back to the house and demanded John King. When the two men rode up to the fence, King was sitting before the fire, eating a cake that had been sweetened with sorghum molasses. Throwing part of the cake in the fire, he remarked, "They have come back to kill me," and got up and went out to the fence where the two men sat on their horses, and they ordered him to get over the fence and go with them. He obeyed and passed on, and they reined their horses around and followed him. He knew that they were unmerciful men and intended to murder him, and he said but little. But as they were leaving, Aunt Sally Holdenpile ran and overtaken the two bluecoats and begged them not to shoot the young man. One of the men halted and conversed with her a while the other man went on with the helpless captive. After they passed on a short while, a report of a gun was heard toward the graveyard, followed by a distressed cry of, "Oh! Oh!" Then a second shot was heard, followed by a piteous cry of, "Oh, Lordy!" Then all was silent. The man who was talking with Mrs. Holdenpile spurred his horse forward and galloped on to overtake his comrade in blood. At this moment, Mrs. Adeline Jones, daughter of John Jones, now the wife of George Holt, in the company of Mrs. Sarah Jane Murphy, who was 14 years old, and Adeline 15 years of age, started to the murdered man. When they reached the spot where he lay, he was lying with his face just over the rise of the graveyard. His head was downhill. One shot had took effect in the back, at the cross of the suspenders. The second ball had passed into his head between the left ear and the back of the head. The man was still alive but unconscious. Miss Adeline and Miss Murphy raised up the nearly lifeless form and turned the head uphill and placed him on his back. Then Adeline broke off some small bushes and little limbs, and putting them together placed them under the dying man's head for a pillow. Sarah Jane now started back for the house for assistance while Adeline remained with him. But soon she met her mother and Mrs. Elizabeth Jones coming, and she returned with them. And by the time they got there, Mr. King was dead. It was decided that while some of the ladies remained with the dead body to guard it from the molestation from the dogs and hogs, the others would go and hunt for a wagon and a yoke of oxen to haul the dead body to the graveyard, which was done as soon as possible. When the wagon was brought to where the dead man lay, the women lifted up the body into the wagon box. A pool of blood had run out at the bullet holes, and Adeline covered the blood from the view with dirt and trash while the dead man was being hauled across the hollow into the graveyard, and she walked behind the wagon and covered up the blood as it dripped through the openings in the bottom of the wagon box to the ground. Now when they had reached the graveyard, some boards were placed on the ground, and the body was taken out of the wagon and laid on the board. In a short time other help arrived. The women and children dug a grave, and just before they commenced to dig the vault, John Jones come and dug the vault for them. When the preparations were made for the burial, the body was wrapped in a bedsheet that Mrs. Holdenpile had furnished and lowered into the grave, and some pieces of plank that Mr. Jones had furnished was laid over the vault and the dirt filled in. A few days after the death of the young man, his betrothed, learning of his death, come over from Sugarloaf Creek to visit the grave, and Miss Adeline and Mrs. Holdenpile accompanied her to the graveyard, where Mrs. Holdenpile gave the girl a finger ring, a pocketbook, and a lock of hair which she had taken out of the dead man's pocket. The ring and lock of hair belonged to the girl, which the young man was keeping as a token of love he cherished for now the poor weeping girl.